Ryan R. is a 24-year-old non-binary lesbian. In Ryan's case, that means that though they are lesbian and like to date women, they don't identify with being called a girl or a woman. They also don't embrace the attributes of traditional femininity, as our society typically thinks of them. Ryan's discovery that they are non-binary came after dating boys in high school, faking physical attraction to males at the time, and then discovering their true gender identity in college and afterwards. Words like girl or woman simply don't describe how I feel about myself, Ryan tells PFLAG's Rick Koonce in this wide-ranging interview. Ryan goes on to say that being non-binary means different things to different people. In their case, it has given them the freedom to pursue both personal relationships and their continuing discovery of self without feeling hemmed in by traditional gender roles and social expectations. So Ryan, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ plus Courage. We're so glad to have you here as a guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have a really interesting story to tell. You and I've had a little bit of a chance to talk about this already.
Yeah.
As you know, this podcast series is focused on showcasing the lives and experiences of people from across the LGBTQ plus continuum. And what makes your story so interesting to me is that you identify as a non-binary lesbian. And I'm wondering, for those not familiar with the LGBTQ plus lexicon, what does that mean?
Well, be identifying as non-binary, identifying as a lesbian can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But for me, I experience sort of a disconnect from womanhood by virtue of being a lesbian, but I sort of feel that sort of disconnect from being what people consider a woman. So I sort of experienced that. So I don't identify as a woman, even though I do identify as a lesbian, and that is common, I would say, or not uncommon amongst lesbians who experience that sort of disconnect with womanhood or femininity. So that is sort of how I identify. Those things are sort of comorbid for me.
Gotcha. And you're 24. Can you describe for us the journey you've been on, identifying and discovering who in fact you are? Can you give us kind of that journey line?
Yeah. So growing up, I always thought of myself as it's like a heterosexual girl, that kind of thing. Even through high school, about halfway through high school, I started questioning my sexuality, but I was not really in the place where I was questioning my gender. Around college, I stopped dating men. I was only dating women. I realized that I was only attracted to women around 2016. And then in 2017, while I was in like a lesbian relationship, I started really questioning my gender. I remember like almost the exact date. It was in November of 2017 where I started feeling uncomfortable with being referred to as like a woman or being referred to as a girl, being referred to with like feminine terms like pretty, that kind of thing, and starting to sort of re and analyze my relationship to my gender, because the person that I was dating at the time was also identifying as a non-binary lesbian. That sort of helped me contextualize sort of how I was feeling as well. And then only recently I started using exclusively they them pronouns with my friends, at least. And then I changed, or asked my friends to call me by the name Ryan, around October of 2020. So it is more of a recent development that I'm sort of accepting that.
Yeah. So, what are the biggest misconceptions about people who identify as non-binary?
I think for me, the thing that I see the most often is the conception that being non-binary is sort of like a third option or a third gender between, or like halfway between male and female. There's like the third non-binary option, where a non-binary is just sort of an umbrella term to describe people of many different genders. There's a lot of different ways that people can express their gender or how they feel personally about their gender. They may feel that they don't experience gender at all, or they may feel that they experience some mix of the two binary genders. So it can mean a lot of things for a lot of people, and I think that if you're not sort of aware of that, you can fall into this idea that it's just like a third option, and that everybody kind of fits into one definition of non-binary when it means a lot of different things.
Yeah, yeah. Now you've dated both men and women, and I'm curious in terms of the nature of attraction. How have you experienced attraction to women, and how have you experienced in relationship to men, and what's the difference?
So I was in relationships with, I had boyfriends in high school. I was never really attracted to them. It feels sort of mean to say, but like looking back, what I was feeling is that they were attracted to me and they made that clear, or they asked me to like be their girlfriend or something like that. And I would go along with it because we were friends. And I was like, this is great because this is just like friendship. And when the relationship got like too intense, or that person like showed too much interest in me, I didn't realize why at the time. I just sort of thought there was like this thing in my head where I thought that I was kind of broken. Not that if you are not attracted to like anybody or something like that, that you are broken, but there is a sort of a feeling of like, why don't I feel the way that this person feels about me? Why can't I do that? And it was only until college when I had a girlfriend in like my sophomore year of college, and I really, really liked her. And I sort of realized that I hadn't felt that way about any of the guys that I dated. So the difference between the attraction is that I was actually experiencing attraction to girls, where I was not feeling that towards boys at all. I think I was sort of, I say this a lot, but when my sister, when I was younger, she would always like call me boy crazy because I sort of leaned on my supposed attraction to men, or I'd be like, oh, that celebrity is so attractive, that kind of thing like that. And it was just not something that I was genuinely feeling, but it was sort of like a projection of how I felt like I should be feeling, or just a misunderstanding of what attraction really is. Because like I can find men to be attractive. I find actors attractive, but I'm not attracted to them. And it's sort of like the idea of putting myself in a place where if I was in a relationship with that person, I'm not attracted to men in that way. And I am attracted to women and non binary people who identify as like feminine in some way.
Yes. So it sounds like, and you talked about the fact you can remember the date to this day when you had this epiphany. It was like you came out to yourself in that moment, it sounds like.
Sort of. I was pretty much a long way of coming up to myself, but it was sort of the first realization that like, oh, I don't think the way that my response to this is sort of not how a cisgender person may feel about it. What happened was that I sent like a selfie because I felt cute, and I sent it to my girlfriend at the time, and they sent back, "Oh my gosh, you're such a pretty girl," and I just felt myself recoil.
Mm,
It
mm.
was sort of like I'd been called a pretty girl in the past, usually by my like mother or like a family member. The idea of being referred to as such all of a sudden made sense why I wasn't comfortable with it. I thought it was just because like, oh mom, you're embarrassing me, that kind of thing. But it's more I don't feel comfortable using those terms for myself. And it's been 4 years or 3.5 years. So it's sort of like a long journey of realizing sort of or trying to figure out why that is.
Yes. So if you were in a relationship at this moment with a woman and she wanted to compliment you, what kinds of words, what kinds of descriptors would appeal and would land in a feeling legitimate and welcome?
Yeah, like it's different for everybody. For me personally, I'm not big on the word pretty. I don't mind beautiful. I think handsome is nice. My I just don't like the word girl. I think
Hmm.
because I or woman. Those two
Hmm.
words are like very strict to me. They don't feel like me. I don't feel like a girl or a woman. And not to say I feel like a man or a boy or anything like that, but I sort of those specific words are so ingrained in like how you that's how you refer to women and girls. You refer to them as women and girls, but I just don't something doesn't feel quite me about that.
Gotcha. And so I'm curious. So, what, in your view, is the difference between a lesbian and a non binary lesbian? What would you say is the distinction there of note?
I think it just comes with the gender identity that you have. Um, Obviously, there are lots of women who or there are lots of lesbians that identify as women. But I do find that there is like a subset of lesbians that are not comfortable with feminine language. A number of lesbians who don't feel that they are a woman in that way. And it can, like I said, it can mean a lot of things to different people. And I do keep on saying that. But for me, it's sort of like when you realize that you're not attracted to men and you're raised as a woman, you have this idea there's this sort of like within the definition of being a woman there is that attraction to men. That's what you're taught. You're like, oh, you're supposed to like boys, that kind of thing. And having that as your identity for a really long time, and then realizing that men are not something that you like need in your romantic life. It's not something you're attracted to. You're not involved with men. You sort of reevaluate your relationship to gender and what it means to be a woman. And for some people, that can mean like that's maybe not something that I identify with. I don't feel like strictly a woman.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious, in the context of a relationship, kind of curious, what can you talk a little bit about relationships you've had, maybe with women, and what resonated with you, and how did you show up to them and they to you?
I think for me, relationships that I've had with women are sort of like there's less expectation with traditional, and not to say that like heterosexual relationships have to be this way, but there is sort of like a the man buys the dinner or something like that, or there's sort of like a set of rules or a script that is like traditionally followed, and that is absolutely not something that people have to follow, but there is sort of that idea. Whereas with lesbian relationships or relationships with women, it's sort of like you don't have to, there aren't any rules, there aren't any of those expectations. So you sort of make it how you make it. I know that there's a lot of stereotypes about lesbian relationships. Like lesbians tend to move really quickly in relationships. There's like a whole joke that what do lesbians bring to the second date? They bring a U-Haul because they're
Yes.
very willing to move in. Or a lot of lesbian relationships I know are long distance because it's really easy to find that like another person in a farther away place or in someone that you meet and you just sort of click with them. And there isn't this sort of expectation of like there's a number of dates that you should go on before like meeting each other's person. There's not that subset of rules. And every relationship that I've had has been really different because there's no rules. Whereas I feel like every relationship that I've had with a guy has sort of fell into like a we go on a date and then we go on another date and then we go on a group date. And then you pay for it and then my parents pick us up or something like that. And I don't know, dating I prefer, I mean obviously because I'm attracted to women, I prefer to date women just because, and obviously because I'm attracted to them, the dates are more fun. There's more things that I'm interested in doing, like going out to museum dates or something like that. Whereas maybe if I was on a museum date with like a guy, I probably would have found it boring because I was not attracted to him.
Yeah.
um, you know, so I think the real difference is finding someone that you're actually attracted to and how those dates go, because you can have fun with anyone that you're attracted to or anyone that you enjoy company with. And if you're sort of forcing yourself, or if there's a piece of you that's sort of not present for that, it can change the whole experience.
Yes, and I'm curious, when I was coming out many years ago as a gay man, I used to think I had a type. And do you have a type, or do you find you're attracted to different kinds of women for different reasons? And if that's the case, what are some of those points of attraction for you?
Oh, I find myself, I present a little masculinely. in part because of how I identify as non-binary. I tend to find more femininity attractive, but I don't think I have a type. I think my type is sort of like personality wise, like I'm attracted to kind people, that kind of thing. But in terms of like how someone appears or how they present themselves and how they look, it's not something that I really take into account. I just do happen to date more feminine people because I just probably because there's that more dichotomy, but it's not really something that I focused on when like approaching a relationship.
Yes, yes. Practically speaking, being non-binary, what are the challenges or the opportunities in navigating everyday life? Now, I know in your job right now, and we don't need to talk about your job per se, but you
Mhm.
present as female there, correct?
Correct. I'm not out to anyone at work. So I use my given name there, and not to get into specifics or anything, but I do work on the phone, so it's something that I have to introduce myself
Yes.
as a name that's not mine multiple times a
Yes.
day, every day. And I have a pretty high pitched or like a feminine presenting voice. So people assume, that I'm female. It's not something that I get. It's something that I have to just deal with because I'm not interested in lowering my voice or anything like that. But that is the reality is that people perceive me as female. And that is sort of something that I have to deal with because, like I said, it's not something that I'm interested in changing.
Yes. Yes. And so let's talk a little bit, if we can, about your family and how were they with all of this? And I know you are talking, you're in conversation with them, and you're in different places with different family members. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what's happening
Yeah.
there?
Absolutely. In terms of identifying as as a lesbian, I never really got to come out to my family. I was sort of outed just by like like from friends, from school. They ended up telling like someone in my family, told the rest of the people in my family just for clarification. But I never had to come out to them, and they were very supportive. I have a very supportive family. I have a younger sister and I have two younger brothers who are like teenagers. I'm almost 10 years older than them, and they're some of the most well behaved, kind, empathetic children that I've ever come across. So I definitely could come out to them about being non-binary. It may be a weird conversation to have. I am out to my sister as non-binary. I'm not out to my parents. I know that they would take it pretty well. I know that they'd be supportive of me. It's just a matter of building my my confidence up about that because it can be difficult because a lot of people, if they identify as LGBT in one respect and then later down the line realize something more about themselves, they get the opportunity to have already come out to them before and are coming out to them again. But I've never come out to anyone before in my family. So a second identity, a second coming out is essentially my first coming out. And it's something that I'm not very well equipped for. It can be scary, but I know, even if you know that someone in your life is going to be supportive and love you unconditionally, it can be very difficult to bring yourself to do that.
Well, it's making yourself very vulnerable, right? And I'm struck, Ryan, as we talk about the courage that you've had to this point in your young life of acknowledging to yourself who you are and increasingly to the world around you who you are. Where did you find that courage and that self-confidence to be that?
Oh, I have no idea. I never quite thought of myself as very courageous. It's just sort of something that because in part because I've been so quiet about it. It's sort of something that I've come out to my friends about, and a lot of my friends identify as either gay or non-binary or trans. A lot of my friends fit that mold or fit that description, and sort of coming to them saying, "Hey, I think I would like for you to use she, they pronouns on me, or maybe use any pronouns on me, or just use they, that kind of thing." They're equipped and knowledgeable and used to that kind of change or question of them, that they can switch like that. And it's having a supportive environment like that is very, very helpful and very what helps me feel more comfortable doing
Yes.
that.
And within the LGBTQ plus community, I know sometimes people who identify as non binary or even transgender, maybe having identified as something else earlier, sometimes face rejection or, have to deal with suspicions. And has that been your experience at all? Have you had to deal with any of that?
Not with any of my friends, and I typically don't put myself in situations where I'm interacting with people who would question me in that way. And not to say that it doesn't happen, because of course it does. But I have a close group of friends that I know support me, and that's why I'm able to be honest with them. I remember when I came out as a lesbian, or when I realized I was a lesbian, I felt a lot of struggle with myself, primarily because I had identified as bisexual for a considerable amount of time,
Mm.
for a few years, and I was sort of comfortable in that identity, and then realizing that I wasn't attracted to men at all, realizing that I was lesbian, I felt sort of like there is sort of a stereotype that bisexual people are like a stepping stone to being coming out as gay, or a phase, and I hated the idea that I could possibly contribute to that. So there was a lot of fear that I was misidentifying myself, and I didn't want to have to do that. But identity is something that is fluid and something that changes as you understand it, and can change over time for some people. For me, I don't personally think that I was ever attracted to men. Even if I was, that wouldn't detract from the idea that I am a lesbian now. So there's a lot of self acceptance involved, a lot of imposter syndrome, sort of the idea that I'm not actually non binary. It's just that all my friends are non binary. So I'm trying to fit in or something like that, which doesn't make any sense, because if you are considering this for a long amount of time, cis people who don't identify that way will realize that about themselves, and then it's not something that they may be concerned with for a considerable amount of time.
I'm struck by the fact that at age 24, where do you think the rest of your age cohort, people who are not members of the LGBTQ community, how are they with this whole subject matter nowadays? Are they generally accepting? Are they laid back? Are they judgmental? Is it a mix of all those things? What's been your experience?
My experience, I have a few friends from high school who identify as cisgender and heterosexual, and they're kind. They understand, and I surround myself, and I feel like I always have, with people who are willing to educate themselves, and that's something that's really important to me. So if somebody were unwilling to educate themselves on something, it's not something that I'm going to entertain, because I'm not trying to get myself hurt. I'm not trying to put myself in a situation where I have to feel closeted or unwelcome with, especially with like friends. But I find that people my age are typically willing. I feel like the young people in general are pretty willing to understand or educate themselves on these kinds of things, because we're in a period of time where different identities are becoming more understood, especially by the younger generation.
And I think you bring up a good point, and I think this is where I give some credit to the popular media for depicting a wider diversity of human sexuality than just male and female, straight and gay. And I'm wondering, are there examples out there that you identify with or that you can point out to other people of positive depictions of non-gender people?
I'm trying to think. I don't, in popular media, I don't know very many non-binary characters. I think in teen shows, you find a lot of that. I remember when I was younger, like Degrassi, like those kinds of shows,
Hmm.
shows about like people in high school, are more likely to talk about trans people or gay people or bi people, people of different identities, because young people are realizing those things about themselves. And those shows are for those people. So I feel like that's where you usually find it. I find there's a lot of things out there. A lot that I find is in fiction that people write specifically for LGBT people, and in discussions between like trans people who are
Hmm.
discussing like popular media that may not actually give them the representation that they want, but they can imagine it and it's fun to talk about. That's
Yeah.
usually what I find.
And do you feel that we've talked about popular media? Do you feel social media and the interaction that people have online is that helping to accelerate social acceptance of a broader range of sexuality in your view?
I definitely feel that way. I know TikTok sort of became popular for years ago, but especially during quarantine, a lot of people were at home, away from school, away from their jobs, sort of given the time to reflect on themselves and away from society and societal expectations. And then a lot of people, there's sort of like a joke, sort of, that's running around of people coming out of like coming into quarantine and then 2 weeks later realizing, oh, I'm actually non-binary and bisexual and I have ADHD, like realizing all these things about themselves at once because they have the words to give those feelings and the time to understand those feelings within themselves. So I think that social media is definitely very helpful for young people. Like I know on Twitter is the main social network that I use. And when you have a lot of people have like their pronouns in their bio on Twitter,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and because you're not looking at them, you don't have an idea of usually if people aren't like posting their selfies or something like that, you don't have an idea of what this person looks like. You can't have that preconception. If someone tells you my pronouns are they them, you're not going to be like, well, you look like a he him or you look like a she her, like, so I'm going to use those. So there is that sort of like people are educating themselves because they're seeing these identities and interacting with people the way that they want to be interacted with.
Yes. You mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'm kind of intrigued with this, that gender identity can be fluid and situational. And do you see yourself as gender fluid, at least to a little bit of an extent, or not?
I'm not quite sure exactly where I am. I do identify a little bit with femininity. I do identify with masculinity a little bit. I don't know if what I'm feeling in my own identity is the experience of feeling more than one gender or not feeling gender at all. It's sort of because you can like I said at the beginning, sort of you can detract yourself from gender, sort of not identify with the idea of gender, or maybe sometimes people experience more than one or multiple genders at the same time, and it's sort of difficult to know where that is when all we really have as a modern societal view is just male and female. When historically and culturally, for many different cultures and many different histories, there have been more than two ways to identify your gender. But in the world we're in right now, where it's just sort of the male and the female, and maybe you don't identify as such, it's more difficult to put into words.
I think that's very well said. And, just a few more questions. This is so interesting. And for someone who might be thinking that they're non binary, based on your own experience, your journey of self discovery, what's your advice to them? What do they do? How do they think about themselves? And where do they maybe find help and resources of support?
There are lots of resources out there. I find that there's lots of literature on gender. There's a lot of studies on it. A lot of schools have classes or even majors on gender and sexuality. And learning more about the concepts of gender can maybe help you further understand what it means to you. There are a lot of resources for trans youth, people who are thinking about their own identities. I would say that the most important thing for me was having a community of people who were supportive, friends who were knowledgeable on the subject, and or even if they aren't like taking classes or experts on the subject, willing to listen and understand and sort of respect where you are at. Because it can be very jarring to sort of one day realize, actually, I don't think I identify in a way that I have by default identified since birth. And I think that the most important thing is to speak with your friends or reach out on either social media or with like public groups like PFLAG or like your school's GSA, or if you're out of school, there are those community centers that have opportunities for discussion for people to better understand themselves.
You have a good friend who was also interviewed for this series who talks about playing with gender, and you know who I'm talking about,
Yes, I do.
and is that a concept that resonates with you or not? And if it does, I'd love to hear about that. Or if it doesn't, what spin would you put on that notion of gender? And I'm thinking back to what something you said a few minutes ago about at times maybe feeling a little bit of an identification with the masculine, at other times a little bit of identification with the feminine. And I'm wondering actually what the notions of masculinity and femininity mean to you.
Yeah, well, so I do present more masculinely. I have my hair cut quite short. I typically wear sports bras or things that sort of compress or like mask my chest. I'm wearing a button-down shirt right now, but a few weeks ago I bought a skirt. I haven't worn a skirt in years because initially when I sort of realized that I wasn't identifying as female, I sort of pulled back from femininity and like wearing eyeliner or nail polish or skirts and things that would cause people to see me and sort of pigeonhole me into their idea of what a woman is. And I think that once you get more comfortable with yourself, societal expectations of you are not going to matter as much once you're more confident in yourself. And it takes a long time for you to get there, but like I did buy myself a skirt and I wore it out and I felt nice. And that's not something I do every day. Most of the time, I will wear button-down shirts or striped shirts, things that like are in the boys section at like whatever store you're going to, or in the men's section, just because I do like wearing those kinds of things more. I do like feeling more masculine in my presentation, but I don't think, first of all, that's not the way that any everyone who identifies as non-binary is going to feel, because you can wear dresses and lipstick and makeup and do your hair and have it long, and still be non-binary.
Mm.
It's just what it means for me at this moment in time is that I'm typically presenting more masculinely, and sometimes if I'm feeling confident about it, I will treat myself to dress up in like a skirt or like a romper or something like that.
Yeah, it's about having the freedom of choice, it sounds like
Mm-hmm.
to me. And so my last question has to do with pronouns. I think a lot of people who are beginning now to become acquainted with this notion of the diversity of human sexuality don't quite get the pronoun thing when people ascribe preferred pronouns to themselves. Could you just maybe talk for a minute about why that is so important to you and to other people that you know within the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I think pronouns are something that people use all the time without realizing it. Like everything is a pronoun. Half the words I used in that last sentence are pronouns because we will use them subconsciously. If you say, "Oh, the pizza delivery person is coming," and your roommate or whoever says, "What time are they coming?" or "Will you pay them when they get here?" It sort of comes out naturally. And I feel like for a long time there was sort of a an argument against they them pronouns, that they were complicated and that people don't use they them pronouns for a singular person in their everyday life, but they do. I just did. It is very easy to. But it's sort of when you realize that that's what you're doing, you can sort of psych yourself out and be like, oh, I didn't realize that I was using they, them pronouns for one person in my everyday language because it's easy to fall back into those she, her, or he, him pronouns. When people have lots of different pronouns that they feel comfortable using, and if you, because it's such a common way to describe a person, how they feel about that is really personal and is really important because you're going to say they feel this way, they feel that way, a lot more than you're going to be using their actual name. And it's important to take into their feelings into account because like if somebody were to use she her pronouns in reference to me, sometimes that can make me feel really uncomfortable because I don't see myself that way, and there's sort of that disconnect. And I think that a lot of people are genuinely learning that right now, which I think is really good.
Hmm. And again, a second last question, and then I'll let you go. Do you think there are more non-binary people around than we normally think?
I do, and that's why I try to, because when you see someone on the street, we have those two boxes that you can put them in, but we know that there are not two boxes for people. There is not really a way to present as non-binary because it's not something that we have a word for or we have another box for already. So if you see someone on the street, you may assume that they're male or you may assume that they're female, but you're not immediately going to assume that they're non-binary unless you're like in that community and you're like they have like a they them pin on them. It's not, or like another pronoun set pin on them. It's not something that you can tell because like if I walk down the street, people will often assume that I use she her pronouns or that I'm a girl. People who present themselves extremely femininely but still identify as non-binary will be assumed to be female, you know?
Mm,
So it's not something that we have the social construct for or the language for, and therefore there are going to be people that identify as non-binary and you're not going to expect them to because one, they may not be comfortable being very straightforward about it, and two, because you're not going to assume that they're non-binary.
mm, Very well said. And you know what I'm taking away from this interview is the idea that you're living your life with what I call firm intention, and you're really encouraging others to be open to and to respect how others live their lives that may not be in keeping with our traditional notions and stereotypes of sexuality. Ryan, I want to thank you for doing a lovely interview with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.